Hi everyone, my name is Ali, and today I'm going to be talking about the bibliometric analysis I did for the fields of performative communication and management. So let's begin with a little context. A lot of people think that the concept of performativity is really complicated, but really it just means creating new realities with words. For example, if I say new rule, everyone has to close their eyes while I talk. I'm saying the rule, but I'm also creating it. So what I said was performative. A lot of economists use performativity to explain economic models too. Because when we create a model, it usually doesn't predict much, but once it's out there, people start to use it, and eventually it becomes a really good predictor of whatever we wanted it to predict, which is actually pretty cool if you think about it. But performativity is a huge field, and because it's rooted in philosophy, linguistics, and sociology, a lot of people tend to interpret it in their own way, and sometimes they even stretch the term a bit too much. This has led to a huge increase in literature, which is good, but a lot of the literature is confusing and can lead to conceptual and interpretation ambiguity. Because of this, a lot of the better-known authors often issue calls in their papers for clarification on the theory of performativity and performative communication. But because there is so much out there, it's hard to really filter out all the noise, especially since almost all of the research done has been qualitative. So I wanted to find out if there were currently any identifiable patterns in PCM literature, which would essentially let me trace the history and evolution of the field. I also wanted to see if I could find trends that may be emerging and what the implication of the trends was. This was a look in the opposite direction. Trends would tell me what was going on with the literature now, but I could also use them to predict where the research might be headed. To answer these questions, I designed my research and this literature review. I decided to do a mixed method study using both quantitative and qualitative methods. I did this because I wanted numbers and statistics to back up my personal analysis of the data. And since I've been researching performativity literature for a few years now, I felt I had enough knowledge to be able to do a good qualitative analysis of the results. I use the Web of Science database because it's super reputable in my field and because I only wanted to see patterns. So if I missed an individual paper or topic because I hadn't used another database, it didn't really matter that much. Also, there was a time limit on this research and I never would have finished by the deadline. I searched for performativity or performative along with different iterations of basically performative utterances and combined that with management. I did this because after a few pilot studies where I tried different search terms and manually reviewing the results, this particular combination gave me the most relevant papers. This way, I didn't have a paper from, say, the medical field that used the word management once in their conclusion or something like that. Remember how I said that I had been doing research for a few years and I thought I was an expert in the field? I was wrong. There was a lot of results, 317 articles from peer-reviewed journals to be exact. These articles were collectively cited 6,993 times, and they in turn cited over 17,500 references. It was so much reading. But I also learned a ton about my field that I didn't know before. The first analysis I ran was a co-citation analysis. Basically, I compare all the papers that my original sample cited, so the 17,500 and something papers. But that was way too many, and I really only wanted the relevant ones, so I narrowed my search by asking the software I was using to only show me references that had been cited over 10 times. This made it much more manageable, and it resulted in 93 references that met my threshold. You can also filter by year, but because I was interested in the history of the literature, I didn't do that here. This is a visual representation of the results of my co-citation analysis. Each cluster is a thematic cluster. That means that the papers in the same color were likely cited by the same articles. Also, the bigger the dot, the more citations it had. Once I had all my clusters, I had to figure out what the content of the clusters actually was. So I downloaded the 93 resources, loaded them onto a qualitative analysis software called NVivo, and did something called coding. Basically, I look for patterns and similarities in the papers and group them together, except instead of using really cool software, I have to do it manually, which means I had to read all the papers. After all of this, I was able to name the clusters, as I knew the overarching theme. Cluster 1 was classical or Austinian performativity. It's called Austinian because it's named after Austin, who coined the term in his book How to Do Things with Words. And this cluster was mostly related to theory of performativity, the history of the concept, and how we applied it to different fields. Cluster 2 was critical performativity, 3 was post-humanistic performativity, and 4 was performative identities and gender. I'm not going to explain these because they're all repeated in bibliographic coupling, and I will explain them then. Some other information I got from co-citation analysis was key statistical indicators: the number of publications, total citations per cluster, average citations per cluster, and how old on average each cluster was. I also had a list of how much each article was actually cited. So for instance, here we have the top 3 in each cluster. This helps if you do any research on performative communication, because most of these people are big shots, and so if you see their name, you kind of already know what they're going to be writing about. As an example, look at Cluster 4. The top 3 papers are by Judith Butler, which is honestly zero surprising because she writes the coolest stuff regarding the performativity of gender. A lot of feminist and queer theory too. I highly recommend her work. But she is also cited all the time, even in papers that aren't even remotely about gender, just to point out that there are other views on performativity. You can see why the field can get a little bit confusing. After my co-citation analysis, I ran a bibliographic coupling analysis. This shows me the connections that the papers themselves have. So from my original set of 317 articles, which ones had been cited together? So through co-citation, I knew what the field had looked like, but I wanted to know what scholars were up to now. As you can see, bibliographic coupling gave me 6 clusters instead of 4, which means that the field continues to grow into even more directions than before. Also, different to the co-citation, you can see there's quite a lot of overlay in clusters 1, 2, 4, and 5, indicating that while they do have distinct research subjects, there is overlap in the authors and some of the topics. But I did have 6 distinct clusters, and once I knew this, I got to do the fun part all over again. Download the papers, load them onto NVivo, and read. A lot. Cluster number 1 is performative practices, pretty much our actions and how they affect the world around us. Number 2, critical performativity, is based on critical research, which tries to bridge the gap between academia and real life. So critical performativity tries to do this as well, but with managers and performative communication. Cluster 3 is performative identities and gender, or the idea that gender is a social construct that we reinforce through our actions. Cluster 4 is the philosophical side of performativity. How do we interpret it in different fields? What does it all mean? Where does it come from? That kind of thing. Cluster 5 is post-humanist and non-performativity. Post-humanist performativity discusses performative practices by non-humans, like a dog or a computer. And non-performativity, well, it's a bit weird, but it's, for example, when I criticize something, and because of that, a change occurs. I wasn't actually trying to achieve the change that happened, but something did happen, and it improved the social situation. So we call it non or anti-performative. Finally, number 6 is performative intellectual capital. And this is the newest field, but it's also growing super fast. It basically talks about how we draw on intellectual capital to develop value performatively. Here we have just a quick little chart that you can pause and look at, but basically it just shows how the different clusters have evolved over time, which ones are growing, which ones are stagnant, and this helped me a lot as well when I was looking for trends. We also have statistical data for our bibliographic clusters, but it's pretty much the same statistics that I got for my co-citation, and we've already been through them. Oh, I also had limitations in this study. Most studies do. But for this particular literature review, I had 3 main ones. Firstly, I only used one database. This isn't that big of a problem, but I could probably learn a lot more if I did a more comprehensive search on articles. Second, I did all of the analysis myself, and this brought two new problems. Firstly, the qualitative analysis was, well, qualitative, which means I mostly judged the cluster names to be what I named them based on my previous research and opinion. Normally, I would have had a peer review my coding and do independent coding to confirm my labels, but time was an issue on this project. Also, the software used for bibliometric analysis was new to me, so it was a learning curve. Lots of mistakes along the way. But finally, I had all my data and a brief write-up of each cluster, its timeline, who the main authors were, and what they were saying. You can read all of this in my paper if you want, but after all the analysis, these were the conclusions. Classical performativity, the biggest cluster historically, had grown and merged with other fields as research progressed. This indicates advancement in the field and is good, otherwise it might become a bit stale. Second, most of the literature was focused on the theoretical rather than the practical, even critical performativity, whose whole point is to apply it to real life. We need more practical field research on PCM. I also found cluster isolation on clusters 3 and 6, showing that they might need to be studied separately from other clusters. Performative identity and gender is a huge and fascinating field, but when we see it cited with the other 4 clusters, it's usually in passing. Performativity and intellectual capital is a very technical field, and it's very new, so it's something to watch out for in the future. I also realized that there is a very large gap in quantitative research, which is why I suggest that more research be done which tries to apply quantitative or mixed methods, even better if you incorporate fieldwork. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this. I know it was a lot and a bit intense, but I honestly love my research. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me. All my info is on the University of Manchester website. Class dismissed.